All right, so for this discussion, we're going to be talking about stress, what it actually is, what causes it, what it looks like, and the impact it has on your body. Well, first of all, what it's for, and then, of course, that impact it has, positive and negative. And then also we're going to talk briefly about how one can go about coping with it, as well as how one can go about, or at least find out how one can be more resilient against the possibility of being overcome by anxiety or stress. Okay, so first of all, the term itself, stress, is referring to actually it's your body's physiological response to an environmental stressor. So if something happens, or maybe you even have a thought, it's generally environmental, but it can definitely be something that's psychological in your own head. Something happens or you're afraid of something happening, and that's going to cause a physiological response in you. Now, the stressor is the thing that caused the stimulus, or stimuli if it's multiple. That's what caused you to get that physiological stress response. So that's the thing that happened, or the thing you thought of that you found to be either threatening, so stressor, is some sort of stimulus or stimuli if it's multiple that is perceived as threatening to your livelihood, existence, or well-being. Seen as threatening, a challenge, or some form of barrier or obstacle. It could be physical or it could be a psychological barrier. That's essentially what a stressor is. So examples of stressors could be, let's go with the threatening. An obvious stressor example for threatening, could be if you're walking around and you come across a lion or a bear. That is definitely a threat to your life. Or perhaps you're walking around at night and you're going down a dark alley. I don't want anybody to be doing that, but you see somebody who looks like they might be threatening. So a stranger, depending on the scenario. Obviously, a stranger in a crowd at a mall that's just walking by isn't the same as a stranger when you're out at night, off in some isolated part, and they're like concealing their identity and they're looking like they're behaving suspiciously. Those are two different things, but you have to sort of gauge that and appraise that, which we'll talk about here in a second. So threatening, challenging, some sort of a hurdle to overcome, I guess you would say. It could potentially be threatening, but any sort of thing that is going to be in your way that might jeopardize the thing that you want. So, a major test. Obviously, it could be threatening, I suppose, but it's not going to end your life if you don't pass the test. But it's definitely a challenge. It's something that's in the way of your goal that's going to cause you to be concerned about it, be anxious about it. That's what anxiety is, when you're worried about something. And that's largely what stress is too. They come together because when you're anxious about something, that causes a stress response, which is what we'll get to shortly. So again, the anxiety is you being anxious or worrying about this future event or something that could happen to you. So a test could be an example of something you see as a challenge. That's definitely a stressor. So immediately threatening to your well-being or life. It could be a challenge that you have to overcome that's some sort of obstacle, or it could be some sort of physical or mental barrier, right? So something you don't believe you can overcome. So that would be a psychological barrier, like, oh, I can't do it. I can't get it done. I'm not smart enough, or I'm not quack enough. I'm not quick enough, whatever it might be. That'd be a barrier, or it could be a physical barrier too, potentially, like, I don't think I can become this strong or lift this weight or jump this higher or run this faster, whatever it might be. So some sort of hurdle, mental or physical. You feel you cannot overcome. The vast majority of stressors, though, are pretty much defined by these two features. They are either unpredictable or unknown. Unknown/unpredictable. So that could be a threat, or it could be a challenge or a barrier. You don't know because you don't know the situation, what's going on, or what to do, or it is something that is actually directly a threat, perceived as a threat. But it can make errors. Like, for example, when you see a lion or a bear, you have an actual stress response, which we'll talk about shortly. Your body's actually responding to this like threat to your life. So you'll get that what's called a fight or flight response, that surge of energy and attention that would enable you to either fight for your life or run more quickly. But your brain doesn't know the difference between a genuine threat and a perceived threat. So if I go to give a speech in front of a bunch of people, and I'm not, like I'm saying, I'm introverted, or I'm just nervous about having to speak in front of people, and I go up here, you might get a stress response because your brain perceives it as a threat, because you have this anxiety about the issue, even if it's not a threat to your life, and your body responds to it as if it is. And that actually can make it more difficult, because your body will divert resources and attention to the fight or flight response, and you'll lose a lot of the focus and memory ability that you have through your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus. Which is why, by the way, when you come up to give a presentation and you are nervous and you do get a stress response for having to do a public speech or presentation, that's why you're much more likely to forget what you were talking about, or panic, or freeze up, and all that is because you're actually experiencing this stress response. So that's what stress is. Physiological response internally to a stressor, and that stressor can be considered a threat, something that's challenging, or some sort of physical or psychological barrier. Regardless, they're almost always going to deal with some form of unknown that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsettled, or something that's perceivably threatening. But again, the mechanisms in your brain that respond to this largely can be disconnected from your prefrontal cortex, depending on the situation or your experience, and that can cause you to assess things improperly as an actual threat when it's not really a threat to your life. By the way, that conjunction is actually from our emotions course that we talked about, because these are actually part of Ladou's theories on how fear and the stress response are defensive mechanisms that we've inherited evolutionarily, theories. So again, this is related to stress is a defensive response, set of circuits. But the issue is that he connected or found was there's a subcortical route and a cortical route, which is essentially saying your prefrontal cortex has a pathway to your amygdala, which is where a lot of this is generated, and then there's also a limbic subcortical route directly to that amygdala as well. So we actually have some conscious connection to our fears, and that goes hand in hand with some earlier theories from Richard Lazarus and his appraisal theory. So these two are actually intertwined. So Ladou is going to point out that, again, there's two pathways to your amygdala which generate this fear and stress response. So to some degree, your conscious awareness of the situation can dictate how you respond to it. So if we're not properly managing that, if we're not properly appraising the scenario, then we're not going to react appropriately to that. And that's how you get people that have anxiety disorders, when they're so worried or gripped in fear over this stressor, right? Something they consider threatening or challenging, but they are incorrectly perceiving it as an actual threat to their well-being or life. At least it feels that way to them, and then they're gripped by this endless stress response and stress cycle, what we'll get to. But don't forget to link those two, because Ladou, of course, points out that this is a defensive mechanism that we've inherited evolutionarily, but critically, the amygdala, which a lot of this centers around, and it's a critical component in this stress response, has a prefrontal cortex conscious cortical connection pathway, as well as the subcortical pathway too. So you actually have some conscious say and awareness in your fears and anxieties, which is why, by the way, exposure therapy can work, or you can appraise things differently by seeing them differently and perceiving them differently as non-threats, or through exposure therapy, like we mentioned, realizing they're not threats. You can actually appraise the scenario differently, and that high road, the prefrontal cortex connection to your amygdala, that can sort of put the brakes on your anxiety and gradually make it better. So these two are pretty critical theories as far as understanding how we get the stress response and how we have anxiety disorders and issues, and how you can actually treat them to some extent through cognitive therapy, where you're appraising reassessing the threats that you perceive as threatening, and then that's possible through this connection to your prefrontal cortex between your amygdala. But anyways, that's what's going to occur. So when, and I've already kind of mentioned this, when you have that stressor appear, and let's say it's a genuine threat, let's say you're not appraising it incorrectly, you're not perceiving it as a threat, it's not. Let's say it actually is. Let's say it's an actual lion, and it's not a lion in a cage either. It's a what's the word? A feral lion, a wild lion, not contained, and you don't have protection. So it's a legit threat. What the stress response is going to do is it's going to tap into your body's evolutionary defensive mechanisms, which again is a Ledoux point. So the stressor is going to cause that physiological response, initiates physiological response. And it's actually a two-part response here. And again, this actually goes back even to the Cannon-Bard theory, as well as the James Lange theory, where they connect your physiological arousal to emotions, as well as your hypothalamic structures and their contributions to these emotional responses. So fear is a big one, obviously, when we talk about a lot, the most, and it's most clearly evolutionary linked. So there's two components to this stress response. So you see the threat, and you have a physiological response, and it comes in kind of two ways. One is through your autonomic nervous system. And if you remember back to Unit 2, this is the one that controls your involuntary actions. So like your heartbeat, your breathing, etc. You can obviously consciously stop your breathing process, but your organs are operating without your consent, essentially, or knowledge. Like my heart, I can't stop my heart consciously, thankfully. So autonomic nervous system is going to activate, and specifically it's going to activate through the sympathetic nervous system. So I'm going to experience heightened phenomena in my physiologically in my nervous system. So heightened heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, all of those things are going to be alerted as these neurotransmitters are released, and these neurons are activating my response. This is where you get the fight or flight response. And this is like someone just injects you with some epinephrine. It's a similar scenario. So if you're actually in a situation where you're not threatened and you get this, you'll be shaky. You'll feel like your breathing will pick up. Your heart rate will pick up. You'll start to sweat because your body's using a lot of energy and diverting it to the muscle groups that you're going to use to either fight for your life or run. Okay, so that's number one. And then number two, you're going to have another response that's a little more delayed because this is the neural pathways. This is a more endocrinic, it's an endocrine pathway, so it's a little slower, but it's still quick enough. This is going to be it's called the HPA axis. So that's going to be your hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal. I don't think it's adrenal, but it definitely has to do with your adrenaline, or HPA, is going to respond through the endocrine system by arousing you hormonally through mostly what are called glucocorticoids. And the most common one that's going to be present at the resistance stage, which we'll get to, is cortisol. Is the most important one, or the most common one. And that's what keeps your body at a heightened state. So this is the instant response. This is the slightly more delayed response, but the one that tries to maintain that stage. Okay, so this is how your body responds to that threat. And obviously the point is to either run from it or or fight it, and or I did the backwards, fight it or run from it, and that's to save your life. And this was, of course, an important evolutionary mechanism, which has been pointed out before by evolutionary psychologists, including Liddell. But we do have that connection that can appraise it as per the theories of Lazarus and then also Ledoux himself. So that's your basic response. So the way we actually classify this is, this is from the work, this is going back to the 1930s. So Lazarus and Ledoux are like recent by comparison, whether it was the 70s, the 90s, they were putting out their theories, or the 2000s even. But a medical practitioner by the name of Hans Sale is going to propose the theory known as general adaptation syndrome, or theory, or the system, however you want to phrase it. We'll put or system. Syndrome implies that you're stuck in this cycle, but we'll just call it system for now. The theory, essentially, like how it works. This is how the theory works, essentially. Just know that if you're suffering from the exhaustive part of the syndrome, that means it's happening over and over, which we'll get to. So first, you have the stressor, right? You get the autonomic response, and that's going to be the alarm stage. It's actually technically like two mini stages. One's technically the shock stage. You don't necessarily need to know this, where your body actually is taken back, and you actually have a drop in blood pressure, and you're actually, for a split second, or not even a split second, a couple moments, you're actually not well prepared to assess it, because your body has to see it and look at it and determine if it's actually a threat. And then very quickly, because again, this is largely regulated by your emotions, your body's going to assess it and then actually respond to that threat. So that shock stage where you're clueless for a brief moment, and then you have the anti-shock stage, where your body goes, there's the threat, and then it initiates that fight or flight response. So you get the initial stages here of that fight or flight. And again, we're talking mostly autonomic here. And that's the quickest because that's your nervous system. Neurotransmitters are much quicker than your endocrine system through the hormones in your bloodstream. But those hormones are going to be activated here, and they're going to be much more active in the second stage here, known as the resistance stage. Resist stage. During this resistance stage, you're going to have this, of course, autonomic spike, but that's very, very temporary in its duration. What your body's going to try to do, especially if the threat's not dealt with quickly, is your body's going to continue to maintain that heightened state. And that's where the HPA axis comes in, where it's trying to maintain that arousal hormonally, mostly through cortisol. So you're going to have that, how can I phrase this? Your body attempts to address threat, or the stressor, whatever it actually is, by maintaining elevated state via cortisol. Not just cortisol, but that's a good glucocorticoid to reference as far as a stress hormone. So that does make you more alert and does keep your body at a heightened state throughout. The only problem, though, is if you don't resolve the issue and deal with the stressor or appraise it and realize it's not actually a stressor or whatever it is, then it becomes a problem, because if you keep this up, so you get initial shock, that autonomic response, you get going, the breathing and the blood pressure and all of that, and then that, of course, is going to speed up the hormonal process, and those hormones attempt to keep your body and your attention elevated to deal with the threat. You can only maintain that for so long, because you do have a finite amount of resources. You've only got so much energy available, and you can only take in so much air at a time, which you get the oxygen, which of course allows you to process the ATP and then excrete the CO2, and then the ATP allows you to actually use your muscles, and that's dependent upon how much resources you have as far as fats and glucose go. But you can't maintain that for very long. So as this is maintained, if the threat is not handled, you move to two different versions for stage 3. So technically stage 3 is where you have like resolution. So it's option number one, you return to normal. How would I phrase this one? Recover. There we go. You either enter recovery, so returns to homeostasis, and there, of course, would be mostly parasympathetic, where it's slowing it down. Your autonomic nervous system is tuning it back, and that can actually begin here, but we're going to assume you've dealt with the issue. So your body tries to return to a normal state. You've dealt with the threat, or appraised it as not a threat, whatever it might be. Or the more infamous of these options, or let's say you don't deal with the threat. It's consistent, or you continue to appraise it as a threat, or you worry about it in the future, like it's like a form of distant stress. Then you're going to likely fall into this exhaustive stage. So in the exhaustive stage is definitely where you don't want to be. Exhaustive stage. Right, this is where you have completely depleted your physiological or nutritional and energy resources. So you're literally exhausted. Your body just doesn't have the energy and resources to maintain this heightened state. It'd be like, this isn't exactly the same thing, but imagine if you, you can't sprint forever. You have to stop eventually because you don't have, even if you kept running and you used your determination to just consciously override your body saying, oh God, stop, it hurts, you would eventually collapse because you would at one point completely extinguish your body's ability to keep running. Your legs would freeze up at some point. You would actually physically be forced to stop against your own will, even if you wanted to keep running. It's a similar scenario, obviously not as extreme or as visible, but you are draining your body's resources to the point that they're having to divert them from other functions, which are going to be important, like your immune system, maintaining that bodily repair, which your immune system is involved in the early stages of. If you can't use them for that, then that's going to weaken those functions. So by constantly staying in this cycle of this elevated state, because you, again, are dealing with the stressor still, or you've still appraised it incorrectly as a threat, and it's still causing anxiety and a stress response, that's going to deplete you over time. And this is, by the way, why people who are stressed more often than others tend to have shorter lifespans. And we'll talk about some of the disorders they get attached to. They often have worse memory, and they often age quicker too. But let's talk real quick about the types. There's kind of a scale, by the way, of dealing with stress. So there's a stress scale. I don't know what to call it other than just a stress scale. As far as types, there's 1 and all the way to 5, obviously. 1 would be acute stress. So it's very quick. Whoop, it scared you, but then you realize it's not a big deal. And then there's, I don't remember all the stages because they're not that important if I name them correctly or not. Then there's normal, something that pops up and you deal with it, no problem. Then there'd be an intermediate sort of stress state where it pops up and it takes you a little while, but you do handle it and it eventually subsides and goes back and you go to recovery. But the ones where it gets more worrisome, where you start flirting with this exhaustive state, are the chronic portion of the scale, which means it's happening over and over and over constantly. Even if you somehow resolve it, it pops back up again, it's constantly happening to you. Or it never goes away because you're experiencing distance stress, where you're worried about something that might happen later. So here is, the thing keeps coming up and you keep having to have this stress response, or you keep thinking about something that is going to happen in the future, hence the distance, it's not even there in the moment. That's going to keep restarting or reinitiating this cycle. And this is how, certainly by 4 and 5, you start endangering yourself by exposing yourself to this exhaustive state. So how does that actually endanger you? Well, there's a bunch of disorders, both psychological as well as actual physical or physiological disorders slash detriments. Detriment's like the opposite of benefit. Benefit's a good thing for you, detriment's a bad thing for you, it damages you. So, because you are constantly using up your body's resources and overusing your autonomic system as well as your endocrine system, you can experience many different versions or many different types. We're just going to focus on a few. So first of all, the constant use of an elevation of your heart rate can cause you to be more prone to heart disease, which of course almost always ends in cardiac arrest, whether it's a fatal heart attack or a non-fatal heart attack, regardless. Hypertension, which is basically just high blood pressure, which often leads to or is associated with heart disease, blood pressure. You can also experience, be more susceptible to headaches and migraines from the constant worry. Other examples are, this is making you much more vulnerable to mood disorders, particularly depression, which we'll talk about in Unit 8, or if you're in 2020, never, unless you watch other videos or look it up on your own. Those are some debilitating diseases and life-spanning or shortening, and tend to shorten your lifespan. But also, too, it affects your memory, worsened. It affects your hippocampus. It actually deteriorates it faster, so you're actually more likely to lose the ability to make new memories going forward, or at least quicker than others. It's going to damage your cell structure. It makes you less able to repair your cells properly, and that's why you see the aging more frequently. So your immune system is going to be compromised. And when I say that, I mean your immune system is incredibly complicated. There's a whole bunch of functions. I'd highly suggest, by the way, looking up an explanation of the immune system by a German, they speak in English, a German production company or presentation known as Kurzgesagt. I'll link it in the video about the immune system. Best video or series of videos I've seen about how it actually works. Does a wonderful job, far better job than I would ever do describing it. But your immune system is very complex. There are tons of different cells and parts of it, and they all interact differently. They're very dependent on energy, though, and resources. So proteins and available energy to actually fight infections. So whether it's B cells or T cells or NK cells or any other types of the cells, and they all do different things, whether it's communicating about threats, whether it's bacteria or pathogens or fungi, whatever it is, or they are dealing with the destruction of, like, the consumption and dissolving of foreign bodies or cells that have been infected by a virus or are cancerous, or it deals with antibody production, which mark cells for destruction, whether it's bad cells that are cancerous or have a virus or a bacterial cell, or they disable it from even working. All of those require a bunch of energy to do. So the less energy you're able to give to your immune system, because it's constantly focused on maintaining this heightened state of stress through energy and other resources, the weaker your immune system is going to be. So that's going to mean several things. First of all, you're more susceptible to disease, susceptible to diseases, just regular infections. More. So just standard lung infections, other illnesses, viruses, bacteria, whatever it might be. You have less resources, and your immune system is less able to respond to the threat, so you're more likely to get sick, stay sick longer, and suffer more from it. But it also, your immune system plays an important role in bodily repair. So bodily repair is going to be slowed. And you also just have less resources to divert to bodily repair. And then I already mentioned the memory is going to be compromised as well. And you're more prone to cancer vulnerability. Because your immune system is constantly killing cancer cells. You have cells, because you have trillions of cells, and whenever they screw up in their coding, which happens, every 1.5 billion times, they are technically cancerous, and they overproduce and they divert resources away from your body. But your immune system seeks them out and destroys them. But if your immune system is weakened, so there's less patrolling cells, or they have less ability to fight and kill off these cells as they reproduce, you're more vulnerable to certain types of cancer. So there's a whole bunch of negative health effects that go along with it. There are a couple positives, though. When it's appropriate, this system is fairly good at helping you survive or do better at whatever the threat is, so long as it's legitimate, first of all, but second of all, it's something you're somewhat familiar with or already good at. So this is actually what's known as the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And that's to do with this physiological arousal, specifically the presence of heightened glucocorticoids / autonomic. So you could classify it as emotional or stress, but we're talking about specifically for stress because that's how they tested it too. They would essentially heighten their either glucocorticoids or epinephrine levels to see how people did. What they found was this stress response and these hormones and this autonomic functioning actually improved performance for simple or well-known tasks. So, for example, if I got nervous because there was a crowd watching me, that's called social facilitation, by the way. I might actually perform better if I'm already good at what I do. Like, let's say I already play basketball and there's a big crowd, it's like a big game, and I get nervous. I'll actually play a little better because I already know what I'm doing. Or it's a simple task like solve a simple puzzle or shoot a shot or whatever. If the task is simple or you already know it, you're familiar with it, this stress response actually enhances your performance. So that's a wonderful thing. However, and that's just a standard linear curve, right? So if you have a graph here, and this is like how well you're doing. This is a 0, this is 100, like as good as you can possibly do it. And then down here would be the amount of these glucocorticoids or physiological arousal. So we'll just say glucocorticoids, 100 being, 100 per unit of volume, I don't know what, and then of course 0 would be 0. The more glucocorticoids you have, we'll use this to represent, the more glucocorticoids you have, the better you actually perform. So when they're in a low amount, they stay low, but as you increase the amount, your performance goes up. So here's your performance, and here's your glucocorticoid number amount. That's standard. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's only though if you already know the task or it's a simple one. If, however, it's a task you're not sure of or you haven't done before, you're not practiced at, or it's complex. So it's something that's not simple, you got to figure it out, or it's new, it's novel, like you're not familiar with it, you will actually perform worse after a certain point. So it forms kind of a weird bathtub curve. I actually did the graph backwards, so it's going to be an upside down one, but that's fine. What it actually found was complex or unknown / novel tasks performance decreases at a point. They've actually found that generally speaking, the harder the task, the more complex it is, the more unpredictable or unknown it is, the better off it is that you're relaxed. But if you already know how to do it and you're good at it, that increased elevation and increased energy is actually going to benefit you. But when you have to slow down and think and focus on it because you don't know it or it's difficult, then it actually hurts you. So the bell curve, or the curve looks more like this. So it starts at a point where a low amount makes your performance go pretty good, and you get a little mini spike here initially, but once it reaches a certain point, then your performance actually is going to drop. I should use a different color for that if I was at all smart. There we go. And then I made that in red, so this is going to be in blue. Ta-da. Already have that one. And now since I wrote this in red, that'll be the curve for the difficult or complex tasks. It looks a little bit more like this, and then it declines. So you kind of have like and I do this backwards, but you get the same idea. It makes like a bathtub curve because you do have a point where it helps at the beginning, but as soon as the task is difficult, increase the amount does not help you. It actually hurts you. So there's like a sweet spot for stimulation or arousal that you want. That's basically what Yerkes-Dodson is. And you could throw it in at emotion if you wanted, or at stress. I think it's probably more appropriate for stress though, because it does help you in most cases. And if you're fighting or running, those are things that we generally, well, maybe not the fighting part, but certainly the running part we would be good at, or if it's a simple task, if we're already trained to fight, we'll do that technically better. But as soon as it becomes difficult or complex, the stress response or the arousal levels are actually going to make it worse or make us perform worse. So that's essentially the overview of actual stress and how it works physiologically with your nervous system and with your endocrine system. The stage is a general adaptation system, and then of course syndrome would be you're stuck in one of these cycles because you're on the stress scale of chronic or distant stress. And that can actually have detrimental effects on your body and mind. And then don't forget also that according to the Yerkes-Dodson curve, increased levels of arousal actually hurt your performance if it's complex or unknown. But if it's simple and you know it, it actually helps you out, which is great. You've got to run or fight for your life. So lastly, we'll focus on how people can cope. So it's more of a Unit 8 topic, but since we've established that connection between emotion and appraisal through Lazarus, and then that connection to your prefrontal cortex by Ledoux, we know that awareness of stress and being able to appraise it and perceive it correctly can actually help people, of course, overcome some of their anxiety and fears and stress. So coping, before we even get to the couple specific types, we do know that appraisal, which is basically your perception, can improve anxiety and fear. Right? And that's Lazarus and his discoveries. And we know that's possible through exposure therapy, which isn't Ledoux's findings, but his discovery of that secondary communication network between the amygdala and the brain, the conscious part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, was discovered by or theorized by this connection. Can help as well. Anxiety. All right, so you can literally just, and exposure therapy is essentially, you constantly exposing yourself and realizing that this thing is not actually a threat, doesn't kill you, doesn't harm you. Or you could have some of the rational emotive behavior therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, where you basically try to logically assess the situation and figure out what your root fear is and why it's potentially not harmful to you, or why you're actually afraid of it, and you can actually deal with the underlying issue that you're afraid of. But that's for another unit. So those are some blanket ways, but more common ways people function and focus and try to cope with stress without using any specific strategies, like appraising the situation differently through a cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy, that's behaviorism. The more common ones are two approaches. They're problem-focused coping, and that's just as simply as they see the stressor as some sort of obstacle or unknown or threat, and so they figure out a way to overcome that obstacle or eliminate the threat, essentially. So if I'm worried about a test, problem-focused method would be, all right, I'm scared or anxious about this test, I'm feeling stressful, so the best thing I do is just study for it so I'm not as stressed about it because I know I've prepared. And then you go through and you do better, and you feel better, and that makes you feel better about future tests as well. So that is fixing or addressing the issue directly with a strategy or solution. So again, example, stressed for test. Problem-focused method would be, I just study for the test. All right, if you're having some sort of stressful relation with your family member, because I know you're fighting or you're disagreeing with them or whatever, the problem-focused method would be not to avoid it or even talk to others about it, maybe if you're seeking advice, but you just want to go and settle that thing immediately. Find that family member or person you're having the argument with or issues with and just talk it out directly and figure it out. So strained relationship, you would just go and talk it out directly. No beating around the bush, no talking to other people about it, just unless you're trying to figure it out, just go right for it. Man, all my markers are running out. The next one would be emotion-focused coping. I'm not sure I like the name here because it's not exactly what's going on in all the cases, but this is where someone looks to either distract, ignore, the stressor, or seek, what's the word I'm looking for? Seek, not aid or count, support, there we go, or seek support. And I don't mean, by the way, somebody giving you a solution, more like just sharing their experience and what's stressing them, and then receiving some sort of acknowledgement or feedback or empathy or sympathy, and that would actually make them feel better. So it's almost like venting or talking it out, and then they feel better about it, even if it didn't change the actual thing. It made them feel better about it. So, or seek support. So example would be, we'll use these examples here. Stressed for a test. One option would be to either, well, we'll go with the first part, distracting or ignoring. You would just literally play video games, see friends, do other activities, and you just basically be putting it off or ignoring it or distracting yourself from your negative emotions in that case. Wouldn't suggest it, but certainly it could work to make you not sit there and worry about it. Or, more practically, would be the seeking support thing, which can work for some people. Wouldn't work for me at all, but it can. By the way, this tends to be a more popular tactic for men. This tends to be a more popular tactic for women. Not necessarily this part, but the second one I'm going to talk about here, the seeking support. But it's not gendered per se. By majority it is, on average, but any individual, male or female, can go either route. Just so happens more men tend to go this route, more women tend to go this route. So yeah, and one of the complaints I've always heard when I was younger, certainly, and I've heard just in general, is a wife or girlfriend will complain to their boyfriend or husband about something, when they're looking just for some sort of acknowledgement or support or empathy, and then the boyfriend or husband like offers like, oh, you should do this instead, like a solution, because that's how they see, that's how they cope with the stressors, and of course that's not at all what they're looking for in this case. But again, that doesn't mean females have to do this and males have to do that. You can vary. We're just talking averages. So strained relationship, like let's say they're having a fight with their spouse, or they're frustrated with their kids, or whatever it might be, or their boss. Rather than deal with it directly necessarily, and maybe they will eventually, but they would seek some sort of seek empathy or sympathy or acknowledgement from a friend or counselor, family member, counselor. Almost like venting essentially about it, and that can make people feel better. That actually for me makes it worse. That just like stirs the pot for me and makes me more upset about whatever it is. Usually mine manifests as anger, but that's what that's a possibility, and some people that works very well for. And this one actually frustrates them instead, or makes them feel unsatisfied with the result. So those are the two basic coping mechanisms that people use. But again, you can also use the technical ones like reappraising it with cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy. But that's a Unit 8 topic for clinical psychology. Very last thing. People can be more or less resistant to stress naturally. And that could be a temperamental thing, a personality thing regarding people's emotional stability. So they could be just not sensitive to negative emotion at all, and then which is low neuroticism, and then they're not really stressed at all in the first place. Or maybe they have moderate neuroticism, but they're really extroverted, so they have a lot of positive emotion, and they don't really experience the negative as much as the positive, which dominates them. But usually people that are low in neuroticism don't get stressed much. Even if they are, it's just temporary and it goes away quickly. But you can actually enhance your own resistance. So I'll say personal resistance to stress. And that has a lot to do with your perspective. I don't mean your appraisal, by the way. I mean your perspective about how much agency you have, so how much ability you have to affect change or to make things right or to eliminate the stress. So we're focusing on what's called the locus of control. I'll say individual control, but that's implied. Locus is basically just the point. And I don't mean like to point them, I mean like the point from which it occurs. So it would be like a tether, essentially. So if you had a ball, you guys ever remember those, you ever play, crap, what do you call it? Did you call it tetherball? I can't remember what it's called. Maybe it was called tetherball, but like you have the pole and then there's the ball that's on a string and you like hit it around and it goes around. The locus or the point would be where the ball's tied on to the pole. That's the point of connection. So this one has to do with the point of personal or individual control. So this basically means, who do you think has the most impact on your life, you or the outside world? So you have those that are less resistant to stress, so more resistant to stress. Actually, list them out first. You have the external locus of control. So they think that the point of control, the control board or whatever, the thing that affects your life and affects how you feel is largely external. So other people or other phenomena, whether it's God or universe or whatever it might be, or gods or some complex understanding of nature or whatever it might be, they or other people, right, in their lives, they have more control over the individual and their life. So if they're feeling down, or they feel like they are not successful, or they're poor or whatever, or they're sick, they don't think that they don't believe they have a whole lot of power to make their situation better. They think that others are keeping them down. Or if they're feeling happy, they think that others are allowing them to feel good or helping them feel good. So this is the belief, our fate, or life is largely, or at least more so, a result of external forces. And that could be a spiritual thing, like a belief in God, capital G or lower G, nature, the universe, spirits, or practically other people or institutions. Are most so in control of your own fate. So your living situation is mostly determined by others or other forces. And this group is far more susceptible to stress, first of all, stress and other mood disorders. And, well, almost all psychological disorders. These people tend to have shorter lifespans. They tend to be less happy and less successful, and successful as defined by the person, like how fulfilled and happy they are, and whether that's socioeconomically or whatever. They tend to do worse in every marker. The group that tends to do far better and is far more resistant to stress and tends to, on average, have a far more fulfilling and successful life, according to their own terms, is people that have an internal locus of control perspective. So that's the opposite of external, right? They believe that the point of control is largely within them. They are the ones that largely determine their fate. They're not stupid enough to think that they have no control, or that they have all control, just like I'm sure most external locusts aren't stupid enough to think that they have no control whatsoever. But the degree to control that they think they have of their own lives compared to people that would be on this end of the spectrum is much higher. They believe that if they're sick, or they've had bad luck, or they're successful or not successful, or poor or rich, it's largely because of their own efforts. Again, not specifically solely them, but they have the most impact on their own life compared to other factors. So the belief, our fate and life is largely a result of personal or internal factors. So they're much less likely to look to others for a solution or wait for things to happen. They're much more likely to make them happen themselves, or at least believe that's the correct route. So they're much more proactive. So they look to avoid or better things in the future. They don't react to things more like the external group would. So they're more proactive, involved, and accountable, I guess you could say, in their own lives. And they are the opposite as well. They are far more resistant to stress, psychological disorders, and they enjoy longer, more fulfilled lives. And they find that out too, by the way. And I must say, while this group is, if you believe that no outside factors have anything to do with it, even if you're not religious, it's very clear that the outside world has some impact on your life and your predicament. But you would do yourself a large favor by reorienting your thought to, okay, fair enough, there are some things out of my control, but I have a large amount of impact on my own life. So if something about my life is not ideal that I don't like, I shouldn't blame others necessarily or exclusively, because again, you can always correctly blame something on the outside, external forces. But it's much more practical and realistic or effective for me to try to change things on my own, even if I can't to the degree that I want to. Just you pursuing your own, just you attempting to make your life better on your own terms through your own will make you feel better regardless, and it will almost certainly also make your life objectively better, or at least subjectively better to yourself by your own standards. So if you want to be, if you want more success in life, whether that's with relationships or career or whatever it is, whatever by your own standards, you accepting that while there are other forces, you have the most impact, or at least a large impact, and pursuing that, it's going to make your life better psychologically as far as your perspective goes and perception, but also, generally speaking, it also just makes your life better in general because you tend to get more of the things you want than if you were to wait around for them to happen or befall you or blame others for what doesn't go right. So that is the section on stress and coping, and then the next sections will be on personality theories and measuring.